I have a question for you. Do you identify more with the content or the context of your experience? For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about here, I should probably start from just giving some basic definitions. And I'm talking about both content and context because they are very important to mental health, dealing with psychological suffering, and understanding some of the core mechanisms regarding the psychology of awakening. Content refers to the types of experiences you have that are more or less salient in the sense that you can consciously recognize what it is you are experiencing. That is a whole lot of jargon to say. In my example, contents of my experience right now include the trees, the water, the sky, the clouds, everything I'm looking at this given moment, right? If we're looking at heat, engines, electricity, particles, waves, all of these different things you can think of as contents. Now, context is a little bit different. Context refers to the type of relationship we have with our contents of experience or contents in general. So for example, if I look at a tree and I immediately think of something that is peaceful or something that is calming, now we're starting to talk about the context, right? How does my relationship to a tree or my surroundings or this kind of environment manifest itself? Now, contents and contexts are important for mental health because they have played a pivotal role in terms of how we deal with psychological difficulties. In the past, and this is primarily an ongoing shift, so there might still be a little bit of what I talk about here, but in the past, for the most part, we have focused more on the contents for mental health. Now, what do I mean by this? Contents here refers to things like thoughts, feelings, perhaps even neurochemicals, brain structures, neurobiology, all of those different kinds of things. These are all contents. And historically, we have taken this approach of thinking that we need to change the contents to improve one's mental health. Neuropharmacological agents or psychiatric medications, therapies focused on specific thoughts or specific emotions in such a way that you are trying to change that specific thought. These are some examples of content-based approaches. Now, they do help to some extent. We have to give them that. Content-based approaches do work to some extent with psychological difficulties. And they work quite well for other types of fields, more of the hard sciences, so to speak. But we run into a brick wall, so to speak, after a while, because we find that changing contents only gets you so far in terms of improving mental health. I'll give you an example. Somebody comes to a psychiatrist's office with depressive symptoms. I want to get rid of my depression. I don't want to have these negative thoughts anymore. The psychiatrist says, sure, I'll give you some antidepressants. Person starts on antidepressants. Perhaps they're referred to therapy, which is where I might start to see them. Or it could be the other way around. And the person tells me, and this truly has come up in many different types of therapy settings and situations. The person says to me, hey, I started the medications. They work pretty well in the sense that I don't really feel depressed. I don't really have depressed thoughts anymore. But I also don't really feel anything at all, right? And that's quite a distressing thing to hear from a person. I just feel kind of numb. I feel kind of flat. I don't really feel like I'm doing much at all. And this is distressing to the person. They start to realize, hey, there's a little bit more than just changing the content in terms of what I want for my psychological well-being. This person starts to understand that the context is perhaps more important. Perhaps it is not about taking away depressive thoughts and altering neurobiology. Perhaps it is more so about your identification with your thoughts and your identification with your own experiences. This is something that we work more effectively on in therapy. Medications, for the most part, are good at changing the contents of your experience, but the therapeutic aspects, the psychotherapeutic aspects, relate more to the context of your experience. You can see this in psychedelics as well, for example, which are ongoing in terms of research studies and intervention implications and so on. The psychedelics themselves change the content of your experience, but the therapeutic aspects come from how you identify with those alterations in your experience. So in this way, we have seen a shift in clinical behavioral sciences, or perhaps now called contextual behavioral sciences. We have seen a shift towards focusing on the context of one's experience. Perhaps it is not about changing depressive thoughts so that you do not have depressive thoughts anymore. Perhaps it is about changing your relationship to these types of depressive thoughts. And what we find is that when this is effectively implemented, the depressive thoughts decrease, not because we're trying to decrease them, but because we're removing the fuel, the causes of suffering that lead to these types of depressive thoughts. When you get at the psychological mechanisms at play, the context, when you get at the relationship between what it is that is mediating depressive thoughts and feeling depressed, this is where you get to more effective interventions. So again, most people would say they identify with the content of their experience. I am encouraging a shift here to look more at the relationship you have with the contents of your experience. Someone who can do this effectively will notice that it's not really about what you see, it's about how you identify with what you see. So the main takeaway here is that we should be evaluating both the context and the content. They are both interdependent. You can't look at one without looking at the other. Now, in terms of how this applies to the psychology of awakening, when we talk about the context of one's experience, we are looking primarily for insights, intuitions, broader ways of understanding reality and how we identify with reality. The way we do this is through cultivating insights. Insights refer to broad, holistic understandings that apply regardless of the content that we are experiencing. For example, for someone who perhaps meditates a lot, they might find that whatever content they experience, it tends to come and it tends to go. Impermanent, always changing. These types of experiences are transient. It is the same case when we look even with our eyes open and we are not meditating. It just doesn't appear that way all the time because sometimes change is very slow. But instead of looking at 1,000 different types of contents and drawing this conclusion, you could perhaps draw a single contextual conclusion in realizing that change is always going on around us. That is an example of getting a deeper type of insight regarding the basis and nature of reality. So what I encourage you to do and how you can apply this in your own life to help yourself with mental health and psychological suffering is to look beyond the content of what you are experiencing, right? If life was really just about controlling the contents of our experience so we don't psychologically suffer, why not just go into a state of very deep sleep all the time where you don't really have any contents, where you don't really have dreams, kind of like being under anesthesia? You can do that, but is that really the purpose of what you want in life? Is that really how you want to exist? Do you just want a flat experience? Or do you want to live more fully? Be able to identify and acknowledge everything around you without getting stuck in the content of your experience. Being able to see an ongoing flow and relationship in whatever it is you are doing. So the awakening piece comes into play when we start to talk about what type of relationship does all of my experience, internal and external, share? What commonalities can we find? What generalized conclusions can we draw without getting stuck in how the experience appears to me? How is it in its actual core sense? These are the types of insights and ways of thinking that can lead us to a deeper understanding that will help free us from psychological suffering.